At 66 years old, Eleanor Vance believed a marriage built on decades of quiet sacrifice was a fortress nothing could break. But what her husband didn't know, what his greed made him completely blind to, was that the truth always leaves a paper trail. The justice that was coming for him would cross oceans to find his stolen accounts. If you have ever had your absolute trust weaponized against you, if you have ever been erased from the life you built with your own hands, if you have ever been left standing in the cold while someone walked away with your future, this story is for you. Subscribe now, because what Eleanor discovered beneath the rotting floorboards of a forgotten tidal mill will prove that true justice never misses its mark. The wind coming off the harbor carried the bitter taste of salt and exhaust. Eleanor stood on the concrete steps of the downtown legal building. Her heavy navy wool coat offered little protection against the November damp. Pedestrians hurried past her with their heads down against the drizzle. Nobody looked twice at the woman standing perfectly still near the revolving doors. She kept her right hand buried deep in her coat pocket. Her fingers traced the cold, heavy edge of a brass nautical compass. It had belonged to her grandfather. It was the only physical object from her own family she still carried. 40 minutes ago, a proxy attorney had slid a manila folder across a polished mahogany table. The lawyer had not looked her in the eye. He had simply tapped a manicured finger against a stack of heavily stamped documents. The papers bore her signature on every single page. She had never signed them. Eleanor watched a city bus pull away from the curb, hissing as its tires cut through the wet asphalt. The red tail lights bled into the grey afternoon. Her husband of 40 years was already gone. He had boarded an international flight 3 days before the attorney called her. He had taken everything they built together and vanished into a network of offshore accounts. He had left her holding a briefcase full of worthless photocopies. She squeezed the brass compass in her pocket until the metal dug into her palm. The physical pain grounded her. It kept the panic from rising past her throat. The city around her moved with ruthless efficiency. Coffee cups were discarded in overflowing trash cans. Delivery trucks idled in the loading zones. Life continued as if the foundation of her existence had not just been expertly dismantled. She stepped off the curb and began to walk. She did not know where she was going yet. She only knew she could not stay on those steps. Her sensible leather boots absorbed the shock of the uneven pavement. The rain began to fall harder, soaking the shoulders of her coat. She thought about the thousands of documents she had signed over 3 decades. She had managed the logistics for his international consulting firm from their dining room table. When he handed her stacks of paperwork, she had simply asked where to put her pen. She had trusted the man who slept beside her. She had believed the business was theirs. A yellow taxi splashed through a puddle, throwing dirty water against her shins. She did not flinch. She kept walking. The skyline above her disappeared into low, bruised clouds. Neon signs flickered to life in the storefront windows as the afternoon grew dark. She passed a bakery smelling of warm bread and melted butter. Her stomach tightened, reminding her she had not eaten since yesterday morning. She kept her eyes fixed on the pavement ahead. A drop of cold rain slid down the back of her neck. She pulled her collar tighter. The brass compass was heavy in her pocket. It was a navigator's tool, designed to find true north in the darkest storms. Right now, her world had no north. Every direction looked exactly like the edge of a cliff. She stopped at a crosswalk, waiting for a red hand to turn white. A young mother stood beside her, adjusting a rain cover over a stroller. The woman offered Eleanor a brief, polite smile. Eleanor tried to smile back, but her facial muscles felt frozen. The light changed, and the crowd surged forward. Eleanor let them pass, remaining on the corner. The realization of her new reality was settling into her bones. It was not a sudden crash. It was a slow, freezing tide rising around her ankles. She was 66 years old. Her name was on a lease she could no longer pay. Her bank cards had been quietly deactivated. Her daughters lived thousands of miles away and believed their father's carefully constructed narrative. She was entirely alone in a city of 4 million people. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the brass compass. The metal was tarnished and scratched from decades of use. The glass face was thick and slightly clouded at the edges. She held it flat in her palm, watching the needle tremble. It swayed back and forth, searching for a magnetic pull. Finally, it settled, pointing firmly down the avenue. She closed her fingers over the glass. She took a breath of the sharp, exhaust-heavy air. The fear was still there, sitting heavy in her chest. But beneath the fear, a very small, very cold spark of clarity began to form. He had left her with absolutely nothing. He believed that without his money and his direction, she would simply fade away. He thought she would quietly accept the narrative written in those forged documents. He was wrong. She slipped the compass back into her pocket. She turned her collar up against the driving rain. She began to walk down the avenue, following the invisible line the needle had drawn. Eleanor Vance was 66 years old. She had spent 4 decades building a life she did not legally own. In 1984, she had been accepted into a graduate program for international finance in London. She had purchased a one-way plane ticket. She unpacked her suitcases the morning Richard bought his first consulting firm. She put her acceptance letter in a desk drawer. She never opened that drawer again. She routed international wire transfers while balancing a telephone between her ear and her shoulder. She held 3 different infants while calculating currency exchange rates. She drafted corporate tax addendums at 2 in the morning under a small brass desk lamp. She balanced the ledgers for his offshore accounts while boiling water for oatmeal. When the company faced a lawsuit in 1994, she sold her grandmother's wedding ring to pay the legal retainer. She told Richard the money came from a forgotten savings account. When he needed custom suits for his merger meetings in Geneva, she spent weekends repairing the lining of her only winter coat. She wore the mended coat for 12 years. He bought a new suit every season. She never drew a salary. She never asked for her name to be placed on the corporate letterhead. She kept the machinery of his business running in complete silence. A week before everything vanished, her mornings had been entirely ordinary. She would wake at 6 o'clock. She would grind Richard's imported coffee beans. She would water the 3 maidenhair ferns sitting on the kitchen windowsill. She would wipe down the granite countertops with a damp cloth. She would wait for the sound of his heavy footsteps on the hardwood stairs. She trusted him. Every other Thursday evening, Richard would spread stacks of legal documents across that clean granite kitchen island. He would place a warm mug of chamomile tea near her right elbow. He would flatten the thick paper with his palms. He would place small yellow sticky notes, shaped like arrows, next to the blank signature lines. He would point to the arrows. He would kiss the top of her head. Eleanor would pick up her heavy silver pen. She would sign her name exactly where he pointed. She never read the dense paragraphs above the line. She watched the way his hands moved over the paper. She drank the tea he made for her. She signed away the house. She signed away the savings accounts. She signed away her own legal protection. She did it all without ever looking down. The brass nautical compass always sat on the corner of that kitchen island during those evenings. Her grandfather had carried it across the Atlantic on a merchant vessel. She kept the brass polished. She kept it perfectly aligned with the edge of the granite counter. Richard used to tap the glass face of the compass with his pen after she finished signing the final page. He would slide the documents back into his leather briefcase. He would snap the brass locks shut. Eleanor would put the compass back in its velvet pouch. She had raised 3 daughters in that house. She had taught them to walk on those hardwood floors. She packed their lunches and drove them to violin lessons. She sat in the front row of every school play. Richard traveled to Dubai, Singapore, and Geneva. He bought their plane tickets and funded their university degrees. He sent them expensive gifts from international airport lounges. When they grew up and moved to different continents, they called his mobile phone first. Her oldest daughter lived in London, working in the exact finance sector Eleanor had abandoned. Her middle daughter ran an art gallery in Paris. Her youngest was an architect in Tokyo. Eleanor remembered their birthdays, their anniversaries, and their children's shoe sizes. She wrapped their presents in brown paper and stood in line at the post office. Richard transferred large sums of money to their accounts for down payments on houses. He told them he was proud of their independence. Eleanor quietly made sure those bank transfers cleared. When they called home, they asked to speak to their father about their careers. They asked Eleanor about the weather. Her hands showed the history of her labor. Her knuckles were permanently swollen from decades of typing on hard keyboards. Her lower back ached from sitting in wooden kitchen chairs while balancing his ledgers. She ignored the pain because the work always had to be finished before morning. She had given 40 years of labor to a man who was already packing his bags. She had built the very walls that were about to collapse on her. The conference room on the 42nd floor smelled of lemon polish. The mahogany table was 10 feet long and completely bare. Eleanor sat in a black leather chair at the far end. She kept her heavy navy wool coat buttoned to her throat. The room was heavily air-conditioned. The cold settled deep into her swollen knuckles. A young attorney named Mr. Davis sat across from her. He wore a tailored grey suit and a silver wristwatch. He had not offered her a glass of water. He placed a sleek black phone in the exact center of the table. He did not look at her face. "Mr. Vance requested I play this message for you," Mr. Davis said. He pressed the glass screen with his index finger. A recorded voice filled the quiet, sterile room. It was Richard. The audio was incredibly clear. Faint announcements from an international airport terminal echoed behind his words. "Eleanor, we're just being realistic," his recorded voice said. "At our age, you cannot manage the demands of my life. This is what's best for everyone." His tone was slow and soothing. It was the exact voice he used when explaining complex tax law. "You should have planned better for your own retirement, Eleanor. We're not being cruel. We're being practical. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." While Richard's voice spoke about practicality, Mr. Davis looked down. He pulled his own personal phone from his breast pocket. He began typing a text message under the edge of the table. He smiled slightly at whatever appeared on his screen. He was checking his messages, while a woman's 40-year marriage ended. He did not even pretend to listen. The recording continued to play. "You're not getting nothing," Richard's voice stated calmly. "You're getting the old estuary property. It's a clean break. This is fair." Then came the slight shift in his tone. The mask of concern slipped for just a single second. 40 years is a long time to carry someone, Richard said, especially someone who essentially just did the filing. The audio recording clicked off. The room went completely silent again. The hum of the ventilation system seemed suddenly loud. Eleanor sat perfectly still in the oversized leather chair. Her right hand was deep inside her coat pocket. Her thumb traced the glass face of her grandfather's brass compass. The metal was the only solid thing left in her world. Mr. Davis put his personal phone away. He slid a thick manila folder across the polished mahogany wood. He tapped the heavy cardstock cover. "The divorce was finalized yesterday in a foreign jurisdiction," he said. "The primary asset transfers were completed on Tuesday. Your authorized signatures are on every single page." Eleanor looked at the thick stack of papers. She recognized the dense, numbered paragraphs. These were the documents from her kitchen island. She had signed them while drinking chamomile tea. She had signed them while he kissed the top of her head. Mr. Davis opened the folder. The primary residence to Richard, the corporate investment portfolios to Richard, the joint offshore savings to Richard. While he boarded a first-class flight to Geneva, Eleanor received what he called a generous settlement, a rusted iron key, and a folded property deed for a ruined tidal mill. Mr. Davis pushed the rusted key across the table. It left a faint, dusty brown streak on the polished wood. He placed a single typed sheet of paper next to it. "This is a list of your deactivated bank cards," he said. "Mr. Vance suggests you contact your daughters for transition funds." Eleanor stared at the rusted key. She thought about her daughters living in London, Paris, and Tokyo. She knew exactly what Richard had told them. He had framed her as the one who refused to adapt. He had bought their loyalty with the money she had silently managed. She took a slow, shallow breath. The air in the room felt too thin to support life. Mr. Davis checked his silver wristwatch. He closed the manila folder and aligned it with the edge of the table. "Do you have any questions for me, Mrs. Vance?" he asked. His voice was polite, efficient, and completely devoid of humanity. He was already thinking about his next appointment. Eleanor looked at his perfectly manicured hands. She looked at the black phone sitting on the table. She reached out and picked up the rusted iron key. The metal was freezing cold against her calloused palm. She did not yell at the young attorney. She did not cry or demand to see a judge. She stood up from the leather chair. She looked directly at Mr. Davis. "Tell him I kept the filing," she said quietly. She turned her back to the mahogany table. She walked out of the conference room. The heavy glass door clicked shut behind her. Eleanor Vance walked 3 blocks from the legal building. The rain had turned from a light drizzle into a heavy, freezing downpour. Water pooled in the uneven concrete of the sidewalk. She found a wooden bench inside a glass bus shelter. She sat down carefully. The damp cold immediately settled deep into her lower back. Her knees throbbed with a dull, familiar ache. Her swollen knuckles burned from gripping the heavy canvas handles of her tote bag. She placed the bag on her lap. She unzipped the main compartment with stiff fingers. She pulled out her worn brown leather wallet. She opened the metal clasp and looked inside. She had $38.14 left in the world. There were 3 limp $10 bills folded in the center. There was one $5 bill tucked behind them. There were 3 single-dollar bills with frayed edges. A dime and 4 pennies sat in the zippered coin pouch. She stared at the paper money for a long time. She thought, I cannot rent a room in this city. I am 66 years old, and I have $38.14. I cannot buy a week of groceries. I cannot afford a single night in a roadside motel. The math of survival was a solid wall she could not climb. She closed the wallet and placed it back in her bag. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her mobile phone. The glass screen felt like ice against her bare thumb. She pressed the side button. The screen illuminated the grey space inside the bus shelter. She tapped the green phone icon. The missed calls counter read 0. She tapped the messages icon. The inbox loaded slowly. The top message was an automated alert from a local dental clinic. It was a reminder for an appointment she could no longer afford to attend. Beneath that was a promotional text from a neighborhood grocery store. There were no messages from London. There were no messages from Paris. There were no messages from Tokyo. Her 3 daughters were completely silent. Richard had undoubtedly called them days ago. He had controlled the narrative before she even knew the story was ending. He had told them she was confused. He had told them she was behaving erratically. She locked the screen. The black glass reflected her own tired face. She placed the phone face down on the wooden bench beside her leg. She leaned her head back against the wet glass of the shelter. She closed her eyes. The sound of the city traffic faded into a dull roar. She felt the exhaustion seep into her bones. She thought, I could just stay here. I could sit on this bench until the streetlights turn off. I could let the cold finish the job. This is what dying alone looks like. A city bus hissed to a stop directly in front of her. The folding doors rattled open. Warm air smelled of wet wool and diesel exhaust. The driver looked at her expectantly. She did not move. The driver closed the doors and pulled away from the curb. Tires sprayed dirty water across the toes of her leather boots. She opened her eyes. She reached deep into her right coat pocket. Her swollen knuckles brushed against the rusted iron key. Her fingers found the heavy brass nautical compass. She pulled the compass out and held it flat in her palm. The glass face was streaked with rain. The brass casing was scratched and tarnished. The needle swung wildly for a few seconds. It reacted to the metal framing of the bus shelter. Then it locked into place. It pointed firmly toward the east. East was the coast. East was the estuary. East was a ruined tidal mill she had never seen. She looked at the rusted key now sitting in her left hand. She knew she could walk to a city-run women's shelter. She knew she could call London and beg her oldest daughter for a plane ticket. She could sleep in a guest bedroom and pretend Richard was right. She could become the dependent, helpless woman he had described in the recording. She pictured him sitting in a first-class lounge in Geneva. She pictured him checking his silver wristwatch. She pictured him waiting for her to break. She closed her right hand over the brass compass. The metal was warming against her skin. She picked up her mobile phone. She held down the power button until the screen went completely black. She dropped the dead phone into her tote bag. She stood up from the wooden bench. Her knees popped loudly in the cold air. The pain in her lower back flared sharply. She ignored it. She turned her back to the downtown skyline. She began walking east toward the regional train station. She did not look back. The regional train ticket cost $31.50. Eleanor had $6.64 left in her leather wallet. She rode the train for 3 hours, watching the city dissolve into grey coastal marshland. When the conductor announced the final stop, she was the only passenger left in the car. She stepped onto a wooden platform warped by decades of sea salt. A storm was blowing in from the Atlantic. She walked 2 miles down a narrow road lined with dead reeds, her knees locked with every step. The wind pushed against her chest, physically demanding she turn back. She kept walking. The road ended at a small coastal settlement. It consisted of a diner with checkered curtains in the windows. Beside it stood a gas station with 2 rusted pumps. Across the gravel road was a general store with a faded green canvas awning. Eleanor pushed open the heavy wooden door of the store. A brass bell chimed in the dark, wood-paneled room. The air smelled of pine tar, damp wool, and stale coffee. An older man in a thick sweater stood behind the counter. Eleanor reached into her coat pocket. She pulled out the brass nautical compass to reach her remaining coins underneath. She placed the heavy brass instrument on the scarred wooden counter. The man stopped organizing a display of lead fishing weights. He stared at the scratched glass face of the compass. He looked up at her tired face and her soaked navy coat. He did not ask what she wanted to buy. "My father told me to watch for a woman carrying Captain Thorne's brass compass," he said. "He said she would come when the city finally washed her out." He pushed a warm ceramic mug of black coffee across the counter. "We've been waiting for you." Eleanor stared at the man. She wrapped her swollen, freezing hands around the warm mug. He pointed a thick finger toward the back window of the shop. "The path to the mill is right behind the diner," he said quietly. She drank the coffee. She left the store and walked down a steep, muddy embankment. The estuary opened before her, grey and churning under the low storm clouds. The tidal mill cottage sat at the very edge of the violent water. The slate roof was completely collapsed on the western side. The salt-bleached wood of the exterior walls was rotting at the stone foundation. Shattered glass lined the window frames like jagged teeth. It was entirely uninhabitable. It was much worse than Richard had described in his polished recording. She stopped in the freezing mud. She prepared to turn around and walk back to the train station. Then she saw the massive wooden water wheel built into the stone base. The timber was battered and deeply scarred by 80 years of rough tides, but the heavy iron joints holding the wheel together were perfectly intact. The core structure had refused to break under the pressure of the sea. She walked up the rotting wooden steps. She took the rusted iron key from her coat pocket. She slid it into the heavy padlock on the swollen front door. The mechanism ground loudly against half a century of disuse. The lock clicked open. The door gave way into the dark. The air inside the mill smelled of rotting kelp and ancient dust. The floorboards were warped into sharp peaks. Wind pushed steadily through the collapsed western roof. Eleanor had $6.64 in her pocket. She slept that first night wrapped tightly in her heavy navy wool coat. She curled into a tight corner of the massive stone hearth. The stone was freezing, but it blocked the wind from the estuary. Morning light revealed the absolute scale of the ruin. Her swollen knees locked completely when she tried to stand. A sharp, electrical pain shot through her lower back. Her calloused hands cracked in the freezing, salt-heavy air. She did not sit back down on the cold stone. She began to work. She walked the muddy shoreline at low tide. She gathered long, salt-bleached planks of driftwood left by the storms. She dragged them one by one up the steep embankment. Her shoulders burned with the effort of every single step. She used the heavy wood to patch the massive hole in the western wall. She wove thick bundles of dried estuary reeds to plug the smaller gaps. She found an old cast-iron bucket buried in the river silt. She scrubbed the rust away with coarse, wet sand. She used it to catch the fresh rainwater pouring through the roof. On the fourth day, a man walked up the rotting wooden steps. He wore a faded canvas jacket and carried a heavy canvas bag. He did not knock on the open door frame. He set a stack of dry, split firewood on the covered porch. He placed a small wooden box of iron nails beside the wood. Eleanor stood in the doorway holding a rusted crowbar. "The tide brings in good building wood," the man said, "but you need dry kindling to start the hearth." His name was Thomas. He was a retired maritime archivist from the coastal village. He came to the estuary on Tuesdays to paint watercolors of the water wheel. He never mentioned the empty bedroom in his own small house. He never mentioned the daughter who used to sleep there. He simply left the nails and walked back toward the grey beach. Eleanor used the iron nails to secure the driftwood floorboards. She built a small fire in the massive stone hearth. The smoke drew the dampness out of the surviving interior timber. She established a strict rhythm to survive the coastal cold. Wake at dawn. Collect driftwood from the high tide line. Carry fresh water in the iron bucket. Hammer the heavy nails into the salt-cured wood. Every strike of the rusted hammer sent a shockwave into her swollen knuckles. She welcomed the pain. A severe coastal gale hit the estuary on the 11th night. The wind screamed off the Atlantic in continuous, violent bursts. Freezing rain blew sideways through the woven window reeds. The temperature inside the mill dropped below freezing. Eleanor lay on her damp wool coat near the dying fire. Her lower back spasmed violently with every breath. She could not feel her toes inside her leather boots. She reached into her canvas tote bag. She pulled out her mobile phone. She plugged it into a small battery pack Thomas had left on the porch. The glass screen illuminated the dark, freezing room. The missed calls counter read 0. The message inbox was completely empty. 30 years of managing a family, and not one person was looking for her. She thought, "I cannot survive the winter in a ruined mill. I am 66 years old, and my body is failing. I cannot patch a roof in a freezing gale. The cold will stop my heart before morning. This is where I die. This is exactly what Richard wanted. She closed her eyes and waited for the freezing numbness to spread. Then she heard a sound beneath the roar of the storm. It was a deep, heavy, rhythmic groaning. It was the massive wooden water wheel outside her patched window. The violent tide was pushing against the battered timber. The heavy iron joints were holding tight. The wheel was turning. It was using the sheer force of the storm to move forward. Eleanor opened her eyes. She pushed herself up from the freezing stone floor. She screamed at the collapsed roof, at the freezing rain, at the dark. I am not dying in this mud. I am not dying because a coward forged my name. I am 66 years old, and I still matter. She grabbed the rusted crowbar and walked toward the weakest wall. The storm passed just before dawn, leaving a heavy silence behind. The tide receded slowly, pulling the violent water back into the Atlantic. The estuary lay flat and grey under the morning light. Eleanor walked down the rotting wooden steps. She carried the rusted iron crowbar in her right hand. The freezing mud immediately sucked at the thick rubber of her boots. She needed to inspect the damage to the massive water wheel. The storm surge had battered the eastern side of the mill all night. She waded into the freezing water up to her shins. She braced her bare hand against the wet, scarred timber of the wheel. The heavy iron gears were completely exposed to the cold morning air. The violent tide had stripped away a massive section of the stone foundation. She crouched lower beneath the massive wooden blades. She saw a square cavity carved deep into the original limestone base. The storm had washed away the packed clay hiding the opening. A heavy iron lockbox sat inside the dark hole. It was sealed with thick black maritime pitch. Richard had always demanded physical copies of his most sensitive financial records. He did not trust digital servers with his offshore routing details. He had hidden them in the one place he believed she would never go. He believed she was too weak to survive the estuary mud. He thought the ruin would keep his secrets safe forever. Eleanor wedged the flat end of the crowbar under the heavy iron handle. She pulled backward with her entire body weight. Her lower back flared with a sharp, blinding heat. The metal groaned against the wet stone. The box slid free from the deep cavity. It fell into the wet mud with a dull, heavy thud. She dropped the crowbar into the shallow water. She grabbed the iron handle with both hands. She dragged the heavy lockbox up the wooden steps. Her breathing was shallow and erratic. Her lungs physically struggled to pull in the cold morning air. Her chest heaved as she pulled the box across the threshold. She collapsed onto the floorboards beside it. Her wet hands were shaking uncontrollably. She could not stop the tremors moving through her fingers. She reached into her heavy wool coat pocket. She pulled out the brass nautical compass. She used the solid brass edge to strike the rusted padlock on the box. She struck the brittle iron lock 3 times. The metal shattered and fell to the floorboards. She pushed the heavy iron lid backward. The hinges screamed in the quiet room. Inside lay a thick stack of heavy, yellowed parchment paper. Beneath the parchment sat a black, leather-bound ledger. She wiped the wet mud from her hands onto her coat. She reached inside and picked up the heavy parchment. She laid it flat on the dry floorboards. She placed the heavy brass compass on the top corner to hold it down. She stared at the dense, archaic, legal phrasing. She read the first page slowly. The faded letters blurred together in the dim light. She wiped her eyes and read the text a second time. Her hands suddenly stopped shaking. Her knuckles went completely white against the floorboards. She felt her heart physically slamming against her ribs. These were the original heritage deeds to the mill and the surrounding coastline. The documents were dated 1924. They contained an irrevocable trust clause in her grandfather's name. The property could never be legally transferred out of her bloodline. Richard's forged signatures on the divorce papers were completely void. He had never legally owned the tidal mill. He had never possessed the right to leave it to her as a settlement. He had tried to give her something she already owned. She placed the deeds gently aside. She reached back into the iron box. She picked up the black leather ledger. She recognized the worn binding immediately. It was the book he always kept locked in his leather briefcase. She opened the cover to the first page. She read the tight, precise columns of black ink. She read the numbers again. Her breath caught sharply in her throat. She could not pull air into her lungs for 5 seconds. These were not the sanitized tax records she had managed in their kitchen. This was the true map of his theft. Here were the exact routing numbers for the offshore accounts in Geneva. Here were the fabricated shell company names in the Cayman Islands. Here was every single wire transfer he had made over 30 years. He had written everything down in his own hand. He had documented the exact path of the stolen money. She turned the pages slowly, tracing the black ink with her calloused thumb. She saw the dates matching the days she had signed the forged documents. She saw the precise amounts taken from her own inheritance. The scale of the evidence was absolute and undeniable. It was the definitive proof required by international financial authorities. It was exactly what Interpol needed to freeze the offshore accounts. Eleanor sat perfectly still on the hard wooden floor. The brass compass held the heritage deeds firmly against the wood. The glass face reflected the grey morning light. She looked at the empty room. She spoke aloud to the damp stone walls. "You kept the receipts." She closed the heavy leather cover. She rested her chin on the cold leather of the ledger. It was enough. Eleanor placed the black leather ledger and the heavy parchment deeds back inside the iron lockbox. She wrapped the box in a thick canvas tarp. She buried it deep beneath the heavy stones of the hearth. She did not call the international financial authorities that morning. She needed to rebuild her own physical strength before initiating the final war. She turned her attention entirely to the ruined structure of the tidal mill. The property had to be sealed before the heavy winter freezes arrived. She walked the shoreline at low tide and found 4 antique brass cleats buried in the mud. She carried them 2 miles down the road to the general store. She traded the heavy brass to the owner for 2 bags of quick-drying mortar and a flat trowel. She traded a rusted ship's anchor for roofing tar and a thick bundle of cedar shingles. Her daily routine became a strict, unrelenting physical discipline. At dawn, she mixed the grey mortar with river water in her rusted iron bucket. She used the trowel to pack the wet cement deep between the loose foundation stones. She scraped the excess mortar away with her bare thumbs. The wet lime burned her skin and hardened her calluses into thick, permanent ridges. She climbed a wooden ladder she built from scavenged shipping pallets. She stripped the rotted slate tiles away from the collapsed western roof. She nailed the fresh cedar shingles over the exposed timber beams. She coated the iron nail heads in thick black tar to prevent saltwater rust. Her shoulders ached with a deep, burning fire at the end of every day. But the sharp, electrical pain in her lower back slowly disappeared entirely. Her muscles adapted to the massive weight of the wet timber and heavy stone. Her knees stopped locking when she stood up from the hard floorboards. She ate canned beans and drank black coffee heated over the open hearth fire. She slept on a mattress of layered wool blankets Thomas had left on the porch. By the 3rd week, the wind no longer blew through the walls. The interior of the mill smelled of fresh sawdust and dry wood smoke. She found a discarded cast-iron stove half buried near the estuary bank. She dragged it up the muddy embankment, using a thick nylon rope tied around her waist. She spent 3 days scrubbing the heavy rust away with wire brushes and coarse sand. She applied black iron polish until the metal gleamed in the low light. She installed the heavy stove in the exact center of the main room. She routed the tin exhaust pipe out through a patched hole in the roof. The dry heat radiated through the entire structure, banishing the damp cold completely. She gathered flat, sea-washed river stones from the shallow water. She laid them carefully across the mud in front of the porch to create a solid walkway. She poured fine white sand between the stones to lock them into place. She scrubbed the wide plank floorboards with a stiff brush and boiling rainwater. She rubbed raw linseed oil deep into the thirsty, salt-bleached wood. The pale, dead timber drank the oil and turned a rich, warm mahogany brown. She replaced the shattered window glass with thick, clear panes salvaged from an old greenhouse. She sealed the glass edges with heavy layers of white putty. She took apart the rotted wooden steps leading to the heavy front door. She measured fresh planks of salvaged pine using the edge of a straight iron bar. She cut the wood using a rusted hand saw she sharpened with a river stone. The repetitive motion of the saw stripped the skin from her knuckles. She wrapped her bleeding hands in strips of torn cotton and kept cutting. She drove heavy galvanized screws into the new stairs, locking them to the foundation. She repaired the damaged iron hinges on the heavy front door. She chiseled away the swollen wood from the door frame until it closed perfectly. She washed her clothes in the cast-iron bucket using boiled rainwater and harsh lye soap. She hung her heavy navy wool coat to dry near the radiating heat of the iron stove. She looked at her own hands under the bright afternoon sun. The swollen, arthritic joints she had suffered with for years were gone. The soft skin of a woman who sat at a kitchen island had vanished. Her hands were dark, thick with muscle, and permanently stained with oak sap and tar. They were the hands of a builder. Late one afternoon in early December, the heavy storm clouds finally broke apart. Low winter sunlight cut across the flat, grey water of the estuary. The golden light poured through the newly sealed glass windows of the mill. It hit the oiled mahogany floorboards and reflected upward into the heavy rafters. The entire room glowed with a deep, warm amber light. Eleanor stood near the black iron stove holding the brass compass in her right hand. The polished brass caught the afternoon sun and cast a bright circle on the far wall. She looked at the perfectly sealed roof and the solid stone hearth. She listened to the absolute silence of a room that no longer leaked or groaned. The wind howled outside, but the air inside was completely still and fiercely warm. The property was no longer a rotting grave waiting for her to fail. The mill was beautiful. Eleanor reached into the deep pocket of her navy wool coat. Her fingers brushed against a folded piece of heavy legal paper. It was the list of deactivated bank cards the attorney had given her. She pulled the paper out and looked at the typed numbers. She opened the heavy iron door of the cast iron stove. She tossed the white paper directly onto the burning cedar logs. The edges curled and turned black in less than 2 seconds. The paper dissolved into grey ash and floated up the tin exhaust pipe. She closed the iron door and locked the heavy brass latch. She did not think about the mahogany conference table in the city. She did not think about the recorded voice of her husband. She wiped a smudge of black soot from her hands onto her canvas trousers. She thought, "That man is a thief who ran from a phantom. I am the owner of this tidal mill." She stepped out onto the new wooden porch. The freezing winter tide was rushing back into the estuary. The massive iron gears of the water wheel turned with a steady, heavy rhythm. She looked down at the freezing water crashing against the stone foundation. She spoke aloud to the cold wind moving off the Atlantic. "You built it to last, grandfather," she said quietly. The foundation held. She sat down on a heavy wooden bench she had built from salvaged pine. The tight, knotted muscles in her shoulders completely relaxed. The heavy pressure in her chest finally released its grip. Her breathing slowed to match the steady, rolling rhythm of the incoming waves. The constant, vibrating hum of anxiety behind her ribs went entirely quiet. The cold wind hit her face, but she did not shiver. Thomas walked up the gravel path 2 days later. He did not bring firewood or iron nails this time. He carried a battered steel thermos and 2 thick ceramic mugs. He climbed the solid wooden steps and sat on the bench next to her. He poured steaming black chicory coffee into the mugs. He handed her the warm ceramic without saying a word. They watched the grey water move against the shoreline for an hour. He told her about a daughter who used to paint watercolors of the boats. He told her how his house felt too large after the funeral. Eleanor drank the bitter coffee and listened to the steady cadence of his voice. She did not offer empty platitudes about time healing wounds. She poured him a second cup of coffee and watched the tide. By late January, the local fishermen began to alter their morning routes. They anchored their battered aluminum skiffs near the shallow mudbanks of the mill. A man in a bright yellow waterproof jacket walked up her stairs. He handed her a wrapped paper package of fresh silver mackerel. He asked if she needed help lifting the heavy iron storm shutters. Eleanor thanked him for the fresh fish. She told him her own shoulders were strong enough for the shutters now. She lifted the heavy iron latch to prove it. The fisherman nodded slowly and walked back to his boat. The woman who ran the coastal diner arrived on a Sunday morning. She brought a heavy cast-iron skillet and a woven basket of fresh brown eggs. Eleanor built a bright fire in the stove. She cooked the eggs in salted butter over the open heat. They ate at a rough wooden table Eleanor had assembled from driftwood planks. The woman told Eleanor about a business partner who had emptied their registers. She had rebuilt the diner using a quiet loan from the general store owner. Eleanor listened to the sharp scrape of their forks against the tin plates. She offered a warm room and a solid chair. The man from the general store delivered a wooden crate of winter apples. He did not ask for coins or folded bills. He asked if she could repair the torn canvas awning over his shop window. Eleanor walked 2 miles down the frozen road the next morning. She carried a thick steel needle and a spool of waxed maritime thread. She stood on a wooden ladder in the freezing wind. She sewed the heavy green canvas back together, using precise, brutal stitches. Her repaired coat kept the winter chill away from her spine. The store owner handed her a wrapped block of sharp cheddar cheese when she finished. They shook hands firmly. feeling the calluses on each other's palms. The mill became a quiet harbor for the people the city had discarded. A retired carpenter brought his own rusted tools to reinforce her roof beams. Eleanor taught him how to pack the quick-drying mortar between the foundation stones. A young mother from the village brought her 2 small children to the porch. The children collected smooth green sea glass from the mud. The women sat by the stove and mended heavy nylon fishing nets with thick needles. Nobody asked Eleanor about the expensive navy wool coat she wore. They only saw the calloused, sap-stained skin on her knuckles. They recognized the exact physical cost of her labor. When the storm sirens wailed in late February, 3 boats tied off at her wooden cleats. The fishermen walked up her sturdy stairs to wait out the freezing wind. They drank her hot coffee and sat near the radiating heat of her stove. They trusted the foundation she had rebuilt with her own hands. She sat among them and watched the firelight dance across the walls. A black town car parked on the gravel road near the general store in early March. Mr. Davis stepped out into the freezing estuary mud. The wet clay immediately ruined his polished leather shoes. He walked carefully down the steep embankment toward the tidal mill. He stopped at the bottom of the solid pine stairs. He stared at the new cedar shingles and the clear glass windows. Eleanor stood on the porch holding a heavy iron fire poker. She wore her mended navy wool coat and canvas work trousers. Her grandfather's brass compass sat on the wooden railing beside her. Mr. Davis did not offer his hand. He pulled his sleek black phone from his tailored suit pocket. He tapped the screen and placed the device on the wooden porch railing. Richard's voice came through the small speaker. "Eleanor, the girls and I have been so worried about you." His tone was thick, with practiced, gentle concern. "Living out there in the damp is completely irresponsible at your age. We found a beautiful assisted living facility near the city. We are just being realistic about what you can handle." Eleanor did not speak. She looked at the black glass screen of the phone. "The Coastal Authority is developing a commercial marina," Richard continued. "They need the mill's foundation to anchor the new breakwater. I have the transfer paperwork ready for your signature." Then his voice tightened into the familiar impatience she knew perfectly. "Don't ruin a $4 million payout just because you are bitter." He had slipped. He did not care about her aching joints in the cold. He only wanted the land he had failed to steal. Eleanor set the iron poker against the stone wall. She picked up a thin manila folder from the wooden bench. She handed it to Mr. Davis. The young attorney opened the heavy paper cover. He looked at a clean photocopy of the 1924 heritage deed. He flipped to the second page. He stared at a photocopy of Richard's handwritten offshore routing ledger. Paper clipped to the top was the silver business card of an Interpol financial investigator. Mr. Davis went completely pale. His manicured thumb trembled against the thick paper. Eleanor leaned down toward the phone on the railing. Her voice was perfectly steady and completely quiet. "You forged my name to steal a life you did not build. You left me in a ruin because you thought the winter would kill me. The investigator in Geneva already has the original ledger. Your offshore accounts were frozen at midnight." Richard's voice sputtered through the speaker in a sudden, sharp panic. "Eleanor, wait. You do not understand international tax law. We can handle this quietly as a family." Eleanor reached out with her calloused, sap-stained hand. She pressed the red icon on the glass screen. The call ended instantly. She picked up the brass compass from the railing. She dropped it into her heavy coat pocket. She looked at the young attorney standing in the mud. "Take your shoes off my stairs," she said. Mr. Davis closed the folder. He did not say a single word. He turned around and walked back up the steep, muddy embankment. He slipped twice in the freezing clay. Eleanor turned around and walked back inside the warm mill. The heavy front door clicked shut. 6 months later. The September air moving across the estuary was crisp and entirely clear. Eleanor stood on the reinforced wooden porch of the tidal mill. She wore a lightweight canvas jacket over a clean cotton shirt. The heavy navy wool coat was washed and folded inside a cedar chest upstairs. Her leather boots stepped lightly on the freshly oiled mahogany floorboards. She held a warm ceramic mug of black coffee in her right hand. Her knuckles were still thick with calluses, but the skin was healed and smooth. The massive wooden water wheel turned steadily in the high morning tide below her feet. The heavy iron gears clicked with a quiet, predictable rhythm. A local fishing boat drifted past the deep channel marker 50 yards away. The captain, in a yellow waterproof jacket, raised his hand in a silent greeting. Eleanor raised her ceramic mug in return. She turned around and walked back inside the warm, sunlit main room of the mill. A folded international newspaper lay on the driftwood dining table. The headline on the third page was small and densely printed. It detailed the formal extradition of a former international logistics consultant from Geneva. It confirmed the seizure of 3 fabricated shell companies in the Cayman Islands. It noted the complete recovery of millions in stolen marital assets by federal authorities. Eleanor did not read the article a second time. She picked up the newspaper and placed it directly into the iron kindling bucket. She walked to the massive stone hearth she had repointed with her own hands. She reached into the deep pocket of her canvas jacket. She pulled out her grandfather's heavy brass nautical compass. She ran her calloused thumb over the scratched glass face one final time. The metal needle swung briefly before locking firmly toward true north. She did not need it to navigate the dark anymore. She placed the heavy brass instrument directly in the center of the solid stone mantle. It sat perfectly level on the rock she had dragged from the mud. The morning sun hit the polished metal and threw a bright reflection across the room. She looked at the sturdy wooden door she had rebuilt from salvaged pine. She looked at the fire burning steadily behind the cast-iron grate. She took a slow, deep breath of the clean, salt-scented air. She spoke her final words to the man sitting in a federal holding cell an ocean away. "The filing is finished, Richard." She turned her back to the doorway and walked toward her kitchen. The tide rolls out of the estuary twice a day. It leaves behind a vast expanse of dark, freezing clay. It exposes the battered wooden blades of the massive water wheel. It reveals the heavy limestone blocks of the original foundation. The salt air constantly weathers the new cedar shingles on the roof. The Atlantic wind never stops testing the clear glass windows. But the tidal mill does not groan under the pressure anymore. The iron joints hold the heavy timber completely secure. The wet mortar Eleanor packed between the stones has cured into solid rock. The cast-iron stove radiates a fierce, constant heat against the winter damp. A 66-year-old woman rebuilt this fortress, using scavenged driftwood and absolute defiance. She arrived with $38 and a rusted iron key. She was handed a ruined shell by a man who expected her to break. He built his entire international empire on her silent, unpaid labor. He believed her lack of a formal title meant she possessed no power. He mistook her quiet, decades-long loyalty for a permanent weakness. He learned the absolute scale of his error in a federal courtroom in Geneva. The heavy parchment deeds now remained locked inside a dark cedar chest upstairs. The black leather ledger sits in an international evidence vault across the ocean. Eleanor does not need to look at them ever again. She drinks her black coffee on a porch built by her own healed hands. She watches the local fishermen navigate the deep channel markers. She opens the heavy front door when her new neighbors walk up the solid pine stairs. She offers them a warm chair by the fire and a thick ceramic mug. She expects absolutely nothing from them in return. She is no longer managing the frantic, global logistics of a thief. She is simply living the exact life she earned. Deception is an exhausting, fragile architecture that requires constant, daily maintenance. It shatters the moment a single light is turned on in a dark room, but the truth is a heavy, rusted iron box. It is perfectly content to wait for decades in the dark. It survives the salt and the freezing mud and the violent storms. It waits patiently for the right pair of calloused hands to pull it from the deep. If Eleanor's story moved you, if you've ever had your absolute trust weaponized against you, if you've ever been forced to rebuild your entire existence from the mud up, leave one word in the comments, describing the moment she shattered that rusted padlock with her grandfather's brass compass. Because Eleanor's story proves something that is always true. The immense strength you spent building someone else's life never actually leaves your hands. Share this with someone who needs to remember that hitting absolute rock bottom is simply discovering the solid stone foundation waiting beneath you. Because together, we prove that dreams don't age.